Ladies and gentlemen, good morning, well, Excellencies, President, colleagues, dear friends of the Union of Arab Banks. Well, as a Belgian national, I should perhaps first apologize for the weather and the traffic, which actually go quite often together. And to my regret, because actually we experienced a drop in temperatures today and yesterday. It was much better a few days ago. Anyway, that's the situation. Secondly, let me of course thanks once again all colleagues of the Union of Arab Banks for this third edition of the EU-MENA PSD. This dialogue, which is so important, especially on AML, CFT and correspondent banking. And we are keen, as always, to support this initiative because we believe it is really important. And I must say that although well, it's the third edition, we may have hoped that, the importance of such dialogue would fade down, because of course having a dialogue on these issues means also that they are still concerned to be addressed. And I must say that this third edition of this dialogue is again particularly topical, relevant. There are a lot of issues still ongoing, including, by the way, in Europe. If you follow the news in Europe, you know also that on some of those issues, a number of banks and countries have been in the spotlight recently, notably for the handling of dirty money. And these scandals in Europe have exposed some of the gaps in the EU anti-money laundering regime. And as you know, they were also sanctioned quite heavily with high fines, and criminal investigations are still ongoing. Let me say a few words about that, because I believe it's important also for you to understand. And particularly also because those deficiencies are nowadays being discussed in the different EU institutions. As you perhaps know, in 2012, the member states, at least of the Eurozone, agreed to cede part of the supervision, of systematically important banks to the European Central Bank and the ECB. But on anti-money laundering, on the fight against money laundering, it's still the national authorities which supervise compliance with requirements. And these standards prove sometimes to be of different levels in the different countries of Europe. And this has shown a number of weaknesses in some countries or in some banks, which sometimes may be exploited by money launderer. And you know that at least in one case, it's actually the US Treasury which identify a bank as well, a primary money laundering concern, with all the consequences it had on these banks and on the country, and certainly on this bank, because these banks went at the end into liquidation. And that's why no discussion in Europe are about giving more centralized power or coordination power, or or at least ensure at the central level a better coordination, a better cooperation between the authorities, supervisory authorities and financial investigation units in the different member states in the context of AML. Make sure that the AML standards are the same everywhere in Europe and applied as such. Those cases surface in Europe despite the continuous strengthening of the rules, with notably the adoption and the implementation of the new anti-money laundering directive, the fifth anti-money laundering directive, which, as I mentioned, is now binding and actually strengthen requirements in many ways, notably in the identification of beneficial ownership, but also by putting into the scope new innovation, new digital developments, notably the exchange of cryptocurrencies, which of course was and still is a very important source of concern for authorities across the world. Now, my colleague Roger Kaiser will come later on today, and which is the senior advisor in charge of those issues, will elaborate a bit more on those aspects. So we'll not go into the details now. Perhaps one more remarks on the digital developments, because of course this is a source of concern not only for authorities but also for banks in Europe, because a myriad of new actors, often non-banks, startups, are appearing, are developing across the world, and this will add on the important challenge on the fight against money laundering and counter-terrorist financing, especially for those banks which are partnering with those startups, which are not used to the same requirement, or at least to the same, which are sometimes, by the way, not regulated, but do not have the same standards or vigilance, diligence standards in terms of AML requirements. And this will of course require also for banks to adjust for making sure that those partnerships are not used for money laundering purposes. So adjust to take into consideration those new risks. Now, I think it's very important also that these recent cases, which are of course to be sanctions, but this should not be, I believe, overlooked, or this should not overlook, sorry, the extremely positive contribution of the banking sector into the fight against money laundering and terrorist financing. I think banks in the past and still now are investing considerable amounts of resources, financial resources, human resources, to help authorities fighting against money laundering and terrorist financing. There are thousands, as you know, of reports or notifications which are sent every year to financial investigation units. And actually, I believe that most of those reports, which leads hopefully to the prosecution of money launderer, are sourced in the banking sector. So that's also, I believe, very important to highlight once more. Speaking about financial sanctions, of course, this is still very relevant as well. There are still a lot of concern, and certainly in Europe, one of the main concerns, and I guess it's a concern for all banks across the world, is the differences in regime of sanctions between different parts of the world, and actually those differences are increasingly problematic and increasingly difficult also for banks. You have also increasing difference between regime in the US and in Europe on some countries. And this proved particularly difficult, of course, for banks, which are sometimes caught in between different regimes and do not know very well or face a lot of uncertainties on which regime and which requirements to follow. So the necessity for better dialogue there as well, I believe, is key across the different authorities around the world. I believe that banks are happy and keen to follow any regime which is defined at political level, but at least then they should get the necessary certainty on what and how to. Last but not least, and again that was also part of my reference in my introduction, correspondent banking. Well, it's the third dialogue that we have also on this issue. And well, we could have hope, although in some countries I think you see some improvement, we could have hope to see perhaps more improvement in corresponding relationship. But I believe the issue still is problematic in many countries, certainly in small countries, including in Europe. And of course, this is in the context of or the broader context of de-risking. I look at some figures, I think between 2009 and 2011, corresponding relationships fell by 25%. And I believe, as I said, that it's still highly problematic for some banks or some countries to improve the situation. As I mentioned, including in Europe. The reason or the factors leading to de-risking, I believe, are well known. I will not elaborate here now. I think it will be part of the discussion today. There are many faults. What is important, I believe, is indeed to continue to dialogue, to try to understand how to address the issue. And in this context, at the European Banking Federation, we also created a dedicated working group, which actually drafted a report, which is now or close to finalization. A report with aimed at, first of all, again and again, raising awareness on the importance of correspondent banking relationship and the negative impact of that de-risking could have on the global economy. Secondly, to try to identify and summarize in a concise manner the main difficulties for corresponding relationship, certainly in Europe. And perhaps the most important part is support correspondent and respondent banks by offering a possible solution also to the regulatory stakeholders. As it was mentioned by Mr. Fatou, I think notably the exchange of best practices, which I believe is key. And when you look at actions conducted also by some countries in Europe, it proved actually rather valuable because many concerns or problems around correspondent banking relationships are also due to the lack of proper information, proper exchange, and proper dialogue. So that's, I think it's a good transition to my conclusion. Highlighting once again the importance of a dialogue, and that's why I believe a workshop such as today is highly relevant. and I encourage you, of course, well, to continue such a dialogue in a very constructive and fruitful manner, and therefore I wish you a very fruitful exchange today, and you can count, of course, on the EBF to be part of those exchanges today as well and in the future. Thanks a lot.